How Viking Children Were Raised from Birth to Death. Part 1. Imagine opening your eyes for the very first time in a world where survival mattered more than comfort. There were no schools, no toys made of plastic, and no peaceful childhood as we know it today. Instead, you were born into a small wooden house surrounded by icy seas, towering mountains, and endless forests. Every season brought new dangers, and every family knew that life could change in a single day. This was the world of the Vikings. When a child was born, the first few days were incredibly important. The baby wasn't immediately considered a full member of the family. The father had the final say. He would examine the newborn, and if he accepted the child, a naming ceremony followed. Water was sprinkled over the baby's head, and the child officially became part of the household. Names were often inherited from grandparents or famous ancestors because Vikings believed that a respected name carried strength and honor into the next generation. Unlike many people imagine, Viking parents genuinely cared for their children. Archaeologists have discovered tiny leather shoes, carefully carved wooden toys, and miniature boats made by loving hands. These weren't the possessions of a people who ignored childhood. They were signs of families that wanted their children to smile, even in a harsh world. During the first years of life, boys and girls were treated almost the same. They stayed close to their mothers, who taught them their first words, songs, and stories. Around the evening fire, children listened to tales about Odin, Thor, Loki, and brave warriors who entered Valhalla after glorious deaths. Long before they ever held a weapon, these stories shaped the way they saw the world. Courage, loyalty, and honor weren't just ideas, they became the foundation of a Viking's life. Life in a Viking village was busy from sunrise until sunset. Children quickly learned that everyone had responsibilities. Even a 5-year-old could help collect eggs, feed chickens, carry water, or gather firewood. These small tasks weren't meant as punishment. They were lessons in survival. Every pair of hands mattered, especially during the long Scandinavian winters when food became scarce and every mistake could have serious consequences. Of course, children still found time to play. They raced across fields, climbed rocks, wrestled with friends, and pretended to sail across distant oceans in small wooden boats. Many games secretly prepared them for adulthood. Wrestling built strength, running improved endurance, and balance games helped develop agility. Without realizing it, every game became another lesson. One of the most treasured gifts a young boy could receive was a small wooden sword or axe. It wasn't dangerous enough to cause real harm, but it allowed children to copy the adults they admired. They imagined themselves fighting legendary monsters or defending their village from enemies. Every hero they heard about around the fire became someone they wanted to become. Girls also enjoyed active childhoods. While they learned weaving, cooking, and caring for younger siblings, they weren't expected to spend every moment indoors. They explored forests, helped with farming, fished alongside their families, and learned skills that would one day allow them to manage an entire household. In Viking society, women held far more responsibility than many people realize. When men sailed away for months, it was often the women who kept everything running. Around the age of 7, childhood slowly began to change. This was the moment when boys started following their fathers much more closely. They learned how to split wood with an axe, repair fences, row long distances, fish in cold rivers, and track animals through dense forests. Every lesson had a practical purpose. There were no classrooms or written exams. Nature itself became the teacher. A father rarely sat his son down for a lecture. Instead, he simply expected him to watch carefully. A mistake while chopping wood could mean injury. A mistake while steering a boat could mean drowning. Learning by observation was often the difference between life and death. Swimming became another essential skill. Viking children weren't taught in calm swimming pools. They learned in freezing lakes and rough coastal waters where strong currents tested their courage. Falling into the sea during a voyage wasn't uncommon, and anyone who couldn't swim had little chance of surviving. As boys grew older, they were introduced to hunting. At first, they carried supplies or watched experienced hunters. Later, they learned how to use bows, throw spears, and move silently through the forest. Hunting wasn't simply about bringing home food. It taught patience, teamwork, and the ability to stay calm under pressure, qualities every future warrior would need. By the age of 10 or 11, many boys had already become surprisingly strong. Years of rowing, climbing, farming, and hunting had built muscles naturally. They didn't train because they dreamed of becoming famous warriors. They trained because daily life demanded it. Yet, despite all this preparation, one thing remained just out of reach: the sea. Every child growing up along the Scandinavian coast dreamed of the day they would finally step aboard a real Viking longship. They had watched those magnificent vessels disappear beyond the horizon countless times, carrying fathers, brothers, and uncles toward lands they could barely imagine: England, France, Iceland, sometimes even farther. For every Viking boy, that first journey would become the moment childhood truly ended. Part 2. For most Viking boys, the greatest day of their childhood wasn't receiving a new toy or celebrating a birthday. It was the morning their father finally said, "You're coming with us." Standing beside a Viking longship for the first time was unforgettable. The ship seemed enormous, with its curved wooden hull, colorful shields hanging along the sides, and a carved dragon watching silently from the bow. The smell of fresh tar, wet wood, and salty sea air filled the harbor. For a young boy, it felt like standing beside a living legend. The first voyage wasn't usually a raid. Most fathers wanted their sons to learn the sea before facing danger. They practiced rowing for hours, learning to keep perfect rhythm with dozens of other men. If even one rower lost the beat, the entire ship slowed down. Teamwork wasn't just important, it was everything. Life aboard a longship wasn't glamorous. The men slept wherever they could, often using their shields as makeshift pillows. Food was simple: dried fish, smoked meat, hard bread, and whatever fresh food they could catch along the way. Storms could appear without warning, turning calm water into towering waves within minutes. The sea showed no mercy. Many young Vikings admitted later in life that they were terrified during their first storm. The ship rose high above the waves before crashing back into the water with incredible force. Rain soaked everyone, icy wind cut through their clothes, and every creaking board reminded them how fragile even the strongest ship could be. But fear was never seen as weakness. Among the Vikings, courage didn't mean feeling no fear. Courage meant continuing despite it. After returning from several journeys, a boy was finally trusted with real weapons. Contrary to what movies often show, his first weapon usually wasn't a sword. Swords were incredibly expensive. A well-made sword required skilled blacksmiths, high-quality iron, and weeks of careful work. Some swords were so valuable that families passed them down for generations. Losing one in battle wasn't just embarrassing, it could ruin a family's wealth. Instead, most young Vikings began with a spear. Simple, effective, and inexpensive, the spear became the most common weapon throughout Scandinavia. They also trained with axes, which served two purposes. During peaceful days, an axe chopped wood for the family. During war, it became a deadly weapon. Training wasn't organized like a modern military academy. There were no instructors shouting commands. Older warriors simply demonstrated techniques while younger boys copied them over and over again. They practiced throwing spears at tree trunks, striking wooden posts with axes, and learning how to protect themselves using round shields. Sometimes they wrestled for hours, building strength and balance that would later save their lives. Perhaps the most important lesson wasn't how to attack. It was how to stay calm. An experienced Viking knew that panic killed faster than any enemy. Boys learned to think clearly even when exhausted, hungry, or frightened. Every hunting trip, every storm at sea, and every difficult winter quietly prepared them for that challenge. Around the age of 15 or 16, many young Vikings were finally considered old enough to join larger expeditions. Some voyages were peaceful trading missions. Others were anything but. Imagine waking before sunrise as thick fog covered the sea. No one spoke very much. The only sounds came from the steady splash of oars cutting through the water. Every warrior checked his shield one last time. Every axe was sharpened, every spear stood ready. The young Viking understood exactly what might happen next. He might return home covered in glory, or he might never return at all. As the coastline slowly appeared through the mist, the captain raised his hand. The rowing stopped. For a brief moment, everything became completely silent. Then came the order to move. The first battle was nothing like the heroic stories told around village fires. It was confusing, loud, and terrifying. Men shouted in different languages. Shields crashed together. Spears flew through the air. Smoke, mud, and fear surrounded everyone. Most young warriors later admitted that they remembered very little of their first fight. Only fragments, the pounding of their own heartbeat, the weight of the shield growing heavier every minute, the desperate hope of seeing the familiar faces of their friends still standing. Surviving that first battle changed a person forever. When a young Viking returned home, people looked at him differently. He was no longer simply someone's son. He had earned his place among the men. But despite the stories that survive today, not every Viking became a famous warrior. In fact, most never did. After returning from expeditions, many spent the majority of their lives farming, raising animals, building homes, repairing ships, or trading across Europe. Raiding was only one chapter of Viking life, not the entire story. For them, success wasn't measured only by victories in battle. It was measured by whether they could build a family, protect their community, and leave behind a better life for the next generation. Part 3. For those who survived their first expedition, life didn't suddenly become one endless adventure. Hollywood often shows Vikings fighting from morning until night, but reality was very different. Most of the year was spent at home. A Viking warrior was also a farmer, a fisherman, a carpenter, and sometimes even a merchant. He repaired fences, planted crops, cared for animals, built houses, and helped his neighbors. Without these ordinary jobs, no family could survive the harsh Scandinavian winters. As the years passed, the young warrior eventually married and started a family of his own. Now, everything came full circle. The boy who had once listened to stories beside the fire was now the one telling them. He taught his own children how to fish, how to row, how to split wood safely, and most importantly, how to earn respect through honesty, courage, and hard work. Not every lesson involved weapons. In fact, some of the most valuable lessons had nothing to do with fighting. Children learned that breaking an oath could destroy a person's reputation forever. Hospitality was another important value. Travelers were often welcomed into Viking homes because one day the family themselves might depend on the kindness of strangers. Honor wasn't something you were born with. It was something you earned every single day. As warriors grew older, many stopped joining dangerous expeditions. Their experience became far more valuable than their strength. Young men gathered around them to hear stories of distant lands, terrifying storms, and battles fought many years before. These older Vikings became teachers, advisors, and leaders within their communities. They knew which rivers were safe to sail, how to survive brutal winters, and how to avoid mistakes that could cost lives. Age was respected because it represented wisdom. Eventually, every Viking faced the same final journey. Death was never hidden from children. From an early age, they understood that every life had an ending, and that courage meant accepting it without fear. Funerals could be simple or incredibly elaborate, depending on the person's status. Some were buried beneath large earth mounds. Others were laid to rest inside real ships filled with weapons, jewelry, tools, and personal belongings. These objects weren't placed there by accident. The Vikings believed they might be needed in the next world. Many hoped that brave warriors would be welcomed into Valhalla, Odin's legendary hall, where they would feast, laugh, and prepare for the final battle of Ragnarok. Whether those stories were true didn't matter as much as what they inspired. They gave people the courage to face impossible odds. Even today, archaeologists continue to uncover Viking graves that reveal just how deeply these beliefs shaped their lives. Perhaps the biggest surprise about Viking childhood is that it wasn't built around war. It was built around survival. A child first learned to respect nature, then to respect family, then to respect the community. Only after mastering those lessons did they learn to fight. That is why the Vikings became so successful. They weren't simply stronger than everyone else. They were prepared for hardship from the moment they could walk. Every freezing winter taught endurance. Every fishing trip taught patience. Every voyage taught discipline. Every story beside the fire taught courage. By the time a Viking boy became a man, he had already spent years learning how to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson the Vikings left behind. True strength was never measured by the size of a sword or the number of battles won. It was measured by resilience, by loyalty, by the willingness to protect family even when the odds seemed impossible. The legendary warriors who terrified medieval Europe were not born fearless. They were shaped day by day, lesson by lesson, from the moment they opened their eyes until the day they took their final breath. And that is the real story of how Viking children became legends.